Now, the Women's World Cup, it's almost halfway through. Have you watched any matches? If you haven't, I will excuse you because it is, of course, being hosted by Australia and New Zealand this year. So the games are a little bit out of our time zone, aren't they? But do you support the players anyway? Our very own Lionesses from England, they've reached the quarter-finals. Meanwhile, reigning champs the US are out after a penalty shootout with Sweden. There's been drama, there's been high-stakes competition, skill and grit across the board. And yet still, we must hear these debates every time there's a women's football tournament about whether we should actually be taking it seriously, whether it's as important or as gripping as the Men's World Cup. And look, I understand football is typically a man's world. It's a safe space to be one of the boys, to appreciate the brilliance of the play. I admire it too. So perhaps men who try to deny or undermine the quality of women's football feel like their male space is being invaded. They want to keep that corner for themselves in a world which feels like it's increasingly prioritising the rights of women and others over men. And a part of me, actually, I can understand that. But one thing I cannot understand is this. In the endless fiery debates about trans rights at the moment, where men are often some of the loudest voices, especially on calling for trans women to be banned from women's sports, are those same men actually supporting women's sports when it comes down to it? Or are those same men perhaps joking about skill level and sports bras and saying women's football can never be as competitive or as entertaining as the men's game? That all I'm saying is this: if you feel very strongly about women having fair and competitive sports, whether that be tied to transgender debates or not, then put your money where your mouth is and support our women athletes, because there's honestly nothing you stand to lose from doing so. Yes, we are getting good at it, but we can't compete against you on the same pitch in the same game just yet. So let's just accept that both things can exist and both can be done well, and let's support our nation's best, whether that be at home, in the pub, online or in conversation, because it all counts, of course. Now, on this topic, joining me fresh from Australia is TalkSPORT presenter Shebahn Aherne. Thank you so much for making time, probably a little bit jet lagged. And I want to start, because you were just listening to me sort of opening the show there, I want to say that actually Piers, who I'm obviously sitting in for, I'm not saying this just to delight him. I doubt he's watching. I hope he's on holiday. But of course, he is somebody who's spoken about trans rights and women's sports and the rest of it. And he does support women's football. He's been talking about it a lot. He's released a column today about it, in fact. And I just want to ask you a little bit about that topic he's brought up in this column, which is that activism. Well, this is actually something that Trump's also said as well, that activism is getting in the way of the US campaign, because the US team didn't go as far as people would like. And some are saying they were too focused on activism. What do you make of that?
Well, credit to you on how you opened your show there. I have to say, I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing that, because in the last 24 hours, the abuse that Megan Rapinoe gets from, her own USA fans now, off the back of the activism and the support she has for the trans community, for the LGBTQ community, it's actually refreshing to sit here and go, actually, everybody should just get behind female athletes. Football and sport is a place for everyone. Now, I was reading through Piers Morgan's tweets and I'm like, what is your obsession? Why does Trump hate Megan Rapinoe so much? Why do Piers hate Megan Rapinoe so much? And why they feel they're doing the right thing for everybody to have a place in sport? Why do so many people have an issue with that? I have no idea, because we cannot relate to what they're going through. I don't think that trans athletes decide to be trans because they've got more of an opportunity to do well as women in sport. Do you not think they've battled enough for themselves? Do you not think they've gone through enough hardship and pain and suffering to find a place in a community where they'll be accepted for who they are, to never mind have trolls on the internet giving it and chucking it because they're male, they're dominant, they've got that power, they've got followers, they can influence people so much? I just find it so exhausting. And then I look at Piers and I think, but he seems to love watching the Lionesses. So just leave it. You don't have to get involved in something that you really don't know enough about. He knows enough about sport. He supports England and whatever they seem to do. But I have an issue with that. I have an issue with going for people who have their own battles and their own struggles, who are just going about their business. And Megan Rapinoe is speaking up for those communities. I get that. But her heart's in the right place.
Thank you for your comments. I'm slightly worried now Piers is watching this, because I think he's going to have some things to say. You might be finding yourself invited back into the studio to meet him head on. You made some very clear points, though. You got your point across. I do want to just quickly talk to you before we go to the panel in the studio about the Women's World Cup, what's going down in Australia and New Zealand currently. Did you feel like there's a groundswell of support for the women over there. And do you think the Lionesses can go far?
Sorry, went down the rabbit hole. That's what I do. Yeah, no, absolutely. Listen, being out there, I spent a lot of time in Brisbane and it was phenomenal. You know, they've really embraced it. The fan parks have been absolutely outstanding. The travel and support, I mean, the money it costs to go to any tournament, never mind all the way to Australia, to travel around and support your teams, you know, wherever it is they're going to be. Started in Sydney, then to Brisbane, then to Perth, then back to Brisbane. It costs a fortune and fans are doing it. I think it's a huge change for women's football, the fact that the fans have gone to so much effort to make sure they have been there regardless. The travel and support's been incredible. I think the Lionesses, yes, can go all the way. I am absolutely mind blown from what happened in the game against Nigeria today. And on paper, I was going, okay, England have this down. I've watched enough in Nigeria. I thought they were tired in their final group game against Ireland. And I thought it would have been a walk in the park for England. Now, that was ignorant. By the way, that was ignorant for me to think that. I think they've been phenomenal in this tournament. England are lucky to be through, but they have that penalty shootout experience, right? They've done that before. We saw it in the finalissima against Brazil. They have a winner's mentality as well, but now they're without Lauren James for the next couple of games, and that could be a problem because for me, she was their star. Saw red today, lost her head. She will regret that for a long, long time.
It was fascinating, and in that number 7 shirt as well. Look, Shebahn, thank you very much for giving us your insights, your knowledge, your expertise, and your opinion, strong opinion to open the show with tonight.
Thanks.
Well, let us introduce this story to our pack as well. They were listening in, they were hooked. Associate editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, TalkTV contributor Esther Kraku, and Grace Blakely, the socialist commentator and author. Thanks, the three of you, for joining us. What did you make of that, Kevin?
Well, I watched the game for a start. I really enjoyed it. England were outclassed, outplayed. We got through on the skin of their teeth. And Lauren James just getting sent off, and deservedly so, just shows how competitive it is. But look, you can't take politics and policies out of sport. They've always mixed. I mean, it's always been the case. I remember I'm old enough, the opposition to the white supremacist tours from South Africa, rugby and cricket, 1969 and 70, very successful campaigns against them, Olympic boycotts, all you go. And women are going to speak up. Of course, I don't want to be another one of those men shouting here, but women are going to speak up for trans women in sport or against them around that issue of biological sex. It's going to divide women, it's going to divide players. But I don't see what the point of having a go at them is.
Politics has always been in sport, as Kevin says. You know, does it distract players unnecessarily?
Well, yes, especially when you lose, because then people are going to say if you focus on playing the game instead of your activism, you may have won. And I think Megan Rapinoe has made a reputation for herself, just ruffling feathers in that way. I would say I didn't watch the game. I actually don't watch women's football.
Do you watch men's football?
Yes, I do. I watch women's sports. I watch mainly athletics and gymnastics. So I do support women's sports. I just don't like watching women's football because I'm used to watching men's football. I think the pitches are too big for the women. I think seriously, no, seriously, like when I see them on the pitch, they look like children to me. I'm like, you need to shrink
that much smaller than them.
But the thing is,
there was a debate. There was a debate about reducing the goals.
Hold on, let me finish. When you look at like the female goalkeepers in the net, they look like children because they're they are just not as large. So I think you need to shrink down the pitches.
Is it not then more challenging and more skillful?
I think we're missing the point here massively, which is that, okay, so my niece is currently working as a coach. She coaches a young men's football team near where we live. And she was telling me about all of the massive barriers she faced to getting into her career where she is now and how difficult it's been. She played football for a while and then got herself into this position. And she said watching the women at the Euros, watching the Lionesses, seeing this huge support that the country had for that team was really transformational for her, not just in thinking, oh, maybe I can do this, but actually in the way that she was treated by her peers. So I think we really have to think about not just, who's watching the people at the top, we also think about how this is trickling down to the rest of the sport.
But hold on,
this happened after the Euros. Girls play football in school now. There used to be boys' sports and girls' sports.
I don't understand
the
sort of comparison that's being drawn here. Do you know how difficult it is to become a successful men's football player? I mean, your odds of even getting on a team, how many players on the
But I don't think that's the point because, there is obviously, there's a difference between there being a difficulty resulting from the competitiveness of the sport and there being a difficulty resulting from people placing barriers to your progression as a person in sport.
No, but that doesn't make sense because the whole point of the point of football is based on skill. The only discrimination you're going to get is if you're not.
But I was just literally saying that, like, my cousin who works in this area has had had difficulties because there have been
Because
people who say
what?
you shouldn't be doing this because you're a woman.
No, maybe
which is very different to saying
they are female football players. Hold on,
she's very good.
No, apparently not good enough to make a national team.
A final point from each of you, and then we'll move on. Do you feel you've resolved? I mean,
the thing is, listen, I'm happy that women's football is getting the attention that it deserves and the funding, and more and more people are interested in watching it. I don't think that drawing a binary between saying that actually women's football should be for biological women is the same as trying to exclude people. I mean, that's literally what it's called, women's football. I think on the point that someone like Megan Rapinoe is getting a lot of hatred because of her activism. Well, yes, and especially because she lost. Because if you're going to be an activist and you lose, well, that's a double whammy.
I think that we've always had this argument that anyone who engages in what we call politics, i.e. sticking up for people who are like them in their sport, gets in the way of the sport, and that actually they're only doing this because they're not very good. It's just a way of basically protecting the status quo. It's a way of saying, especially at the lower rungs of the sport, which are perhaps less visible in the public, where you're going to get more kind of a laddie culture and people being excluded. It's a way of saying to people, this is not for people like you.